Hey, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we're diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery, smart, sharp, and worth every minute. The woman arrived at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning in October, which put her squarely in the middle of Wolfe's sacred orchid-tending hours. That alone should have disqualified her. Wolfe spends 9 to 11 and 4 to 6 every day up in the plant rooms on the roof, communing with his 10,000 orchids in a state of horticultural bliss that no murder, no client, and no act of God is supposed to interrupt. I say supposed to, because money has a way of adjusting Wolfe's principles, and the woman who rang our doorbell that Tuesday morning had the look of someone who came with a great deal of it. I know that look. After 12 years of answering the door of the old brownstone on West 35th Street, I've developed what you might call a financial intuition. It's not the clothes exactly, though hers were good. A charcoal wool suit that hadn't come off any rack below 57th Street. It's something in the posture, the particular way money teaches people to occupy space, as if they've reserved it in advance. This woman, standing on our stoop with the October wind lifting the edges of her dark hair, occupied space like she owned the block and was mildly disappointed by its upkeep. She was about 40, though she wore it like a deliberate choice rather than an inevitability. Dark eyes, steady and measuring, a mouth that suggested she was accustomed to being listened to. She held a small leather bag in both hands, not nervously, but with the contained stillness of someone who has decided that visible anxiety is a form of weakness. "My name is Constance Relic," she said, when I opened the door. "I need to see Nero Wolfe." "He's occupied until 11, I said. It was 10:47. "If you'd like to wait, I can show you to the office." "I'll wait," she said, as if granting a concession. I showed her in, got her settled in the red leather chair across from Wolfe's desk, and offered coffee, which she accepted without looking at me. She was examining the office with the careful attention of someone performing an appraisal. The bookshelves, the globe, the 2-foot portrait of Wolfe's ancestor above the fireplace. I poured her coffee from the pot Fritz keeps warm on the sideboard, and took my own chair behind my desk near the door, where I could watch her profile. She didn't fidget. Most people waiting in that office with whatever trouble they've brought to our threshold fidget. They check their watches, or rearrange their handbags, or develop a sudden fascination with the pattern on the rug. Constance Relic sat perfectly still, and drank her coffee, and waited, and the fact that she could do all three simultaneously told me more about her than the wool suit. At 11 sharp, I heard the elevator. Wolfe refuses to use the stairs, on principle and physique. And then his footsteps in the hall, deliberate and heavy. He came through the door, all 285 pounds of him, arranged in a yellow shirt and a brown suit that Fritz had pressed that morning to compensate for the fact that its owner refuses to move with any urgency that might disturb the creases. He was carrying a small clay pot containing a cattleya in early bloom, which he set on the corner of his desk with the delicacy of a man handling something genuinely valuable, which he was. He looked at Constance Relic. She looked at him. "Mrs. Relic," he said, settling into his custom-built chair with the gradual inevitability of a tide coming in. "I am Nero Wolfe. You will forgive me if I ask Archie to take notes. He does so with a discretion I find adequate." "Mr. Goodwin may take whatever notes he finds useful," she said. Wolfe's eyes moved to me, the faintest elevation of a brow, which meant he found her interesting, and then back to her. "You mentioned to my answering service that the matter concerns your husband. Is he dead?" The question landed without ceremony, the way Wolfe prefers. He finds preamble wasteful. "Not yet," she said, "but he may be accused of being a murderer before the week is out. I'd prefer to prevent that." "Who has been murdered?" "Martin Ashwell, my husband's business partner." She set her coffee cup down with precision. "He was found dead Saturday morning in his apartment on East 68th Street. The police believe it was a heart attack. They are wrong." "What makes you certain they are wrong?" "Because Martin Ashwell was 51 years old, had the cardiovascular profile of a man 10 years younger, played squash 3 times a week, and had a complete physical examination 6 weeks ago that showed nothing remarkable. Men like that do not simply die of heart attacks on a Friday evening. Men like that die of heart attacks with some regularity, Wolfe said. However, I take your point as a probability argument rather than a certainty. What is your husband's name? Gerald Relic. He was, co-founder and managing partner of Relic Ashwell Capital, a private equity firm with offices on Park Avenue. He and Martin built the firm over 19 years. They were not friends exactly, but they were partners in the fullest sense. Professionally inseparable. And yet you fear he will be accused of the murder. He was the last person to see Martin alive. They had dinner at Martin's apartment Friday evening. Gerald left at approximately 10 o'clock. Martin was found dead the following morning at 8:15 by his housekeeper. She paused, and Gerald and Martin had a significant disagreement. I hesitate to call it a quarrel, but it was significant, over the direction of the firm. Specifically over a proposed acquisition that Martin supported and Gerald opposed. Opposed how strongly? Her eyes, which had been level and steady throughout, shifted for just a moment. Not evasion, something more like the careful selection of words. Strongly enough that Martin had begun discussing the possibility of a buyout. He wanted to buy Gerald's stake in the firm. Gerald did not wish to sell. How much was the stake worth? At current valuation, somewhere between $40 and $60 million. Wolfe's eyes moved to me again, this time carrying a different freight. Something that, in a man less controlled, might have been called interest. And the police are aware of this dinner, this disagreement, and your husband's presence in the apartment that evening? Yes. Gerald told them voluntarily. He felt, and I agreed, that concealment would appear worse than the truth. A sound instinct, though not always rewarded. Wolfe picked up a letter opener from his desk and turned it once in his fingers. Mrs. Relic, you have told me what the police know. What have you not told them? The pause that followed was approximately 4 seconds. I counted. Martin Ashwell had a visitor after Gerald left. I believe this person is the key to what actually happened. But I cannot tell the police, because I do not know who it was, only that someone came. And if I introduce the idea of another visitor without evidence, and I'm wrong, it only redirects suspicion back to Gerald. How do you know there was another visitor? Martin's doorman, a man named Cressetti, was off duty by 9. The evening man, whose name I don't know, came on at 9. Gerald left at 10. There was a gap in the building's CCTV coverage between 10:15 and 11:40 due to a camera malfunction, or what appeared to be a malfunction. She folded her hands. Someone visited Martin Ashwell in that window. I am as certain of that as I am of anything. What makes you certain? Because Martin called me at 10:30 that evening. There it was. Wolfe's letter opener went still. He called you, Wolfe said, not your husband. Martin and I we were in communication, yes, separately from Gerald. She said it cleanly, without apology or excess explanation, which was either the composure of innocence or the discipline of guilt. At that moment I couldn't have said which. He called me at 10:30 and said only that he expected a visitor, and that if anything went wrong, I should remember a name. He said the name. Which was? Devereaux, she said. Just the one word. Then he hung up. Wolfe was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bus went past on 35th Street. The Catalina sat on the corner of the desk and did what orchids do, which is nothing, but in a way that Wolfe finds deeply satisfying. Mrs. Relic, he said at last, you are asking me to establish that your husband did not murder Martin Ashwell, while simultaneously concealing the nature of your own relationship with the deceased, the content of his final communication to you, and the existence of a person or persons unknown who may have committed the act. You are also asking me to do this without telling the police what you have just told me. which puts you in a position of withholding material information from a homicide investigation. The police have not ruled it a homicide, she said. They will, Wolfe said. He set down the letter opener. My fee for a case of this complexity is $15,000, plus expenses. $10,000 immediately, by check made out to cash, and $5,000 upon resolution. If the resolution is unfavorable to your husband, my fee is not reduced. She opened the leather bag, removed the checkbook, and wrote the check on her knee without asking for a pen or a hard surface. She placed it on the corner of his desk and stood. I would like you to begin today, she said. I will begin, Wolfe said, when I am ready to begin. He turned to me. Archie, names, all of them she knows, connected to Relic Ashwell and to Martin Ashwell personally. She gave them to me, standing, in a clear and organized voice that suggested she'd prepared the list in advance. 4 names beyond Gerald and herself. I wrote them all down. Then I showed her out to the stoop, and when I came back, Wolfe had the check in his hand and was looking at it with an expression that combined satisfaction and mild distaste in the particular ratio he reserves for money he needs and hates needing. She's lying, I said, dropping into my chair. Undoubtedly, he said. The question is what portion of the truth she has substituted lies for, and whether the substitution is relevant to our purposes. He set the check down. She did not come here to protect her husband. No, I said. She came here to protect herself. Wolfe reached for his book. We are in agreement. Get Inspector Kramer on the telephone, and tell Fritz I will require the braised short ribs this evening. This sort of case requires fortification. I picked up the phone. Outside, October went about its business. Somewhere on East 68th Street, Martin Ashwell was still dead, which was at that moment the only fact in the case I was completely sure of. By Wednesday morning, I had a working portrait of the landscape, assembled from phone calls, a visit to the Park Avenue offices of Relic Ashwell Capital while Gerald Relic was graciously not there, and a long conversation over bad coffee with a financial journalist named Peckham, who covers private equity the way war correspondents cover conflict, with exhausted familiarity and residual fascination. Relic Ashwell managed approximately $2 billion in assets across 3 funds. They had been, by all accounts, one of the more successful mid-sized private equity operations in the city. Not flashy enough to attract the tabloids, not large enough to attract the regulator's undivided attention, but profitable enough to make both founders wealthy in the comfortable, lasting way that doesn't photograph well, but sleeps soundly. That had been the condition for most of their 19-year partnership. In the last 18 months, conditions had changed. The change had a name, the Meridian Logistics acquisition. Martin Ashwell had identified a struggling regional logistics company as a leveraged buyout target, convinced 3 of their fund's major investors, and committed $600 million, their largest single investment ever. Gerald Relic had opposed it from the start, on the grounds that the logistics sector was in structural decline, and Meridian's balance sheet was, in his phrase, a velvet alibi for a garbage fire. The phrase had apparently entered the firm's internal mythology. Someone told Peckham about it. Peckham told me. The acquisition had closed 8 months ago. Meridian, as of last quarter, was underperforming projections by 30%. Gerald Relic had been right. Martin Ashwell had been wrong. And in the private equity world, being wrong with $600 million of other people's money has consequences that tend to be personal, professional, and sequential. I brought all of this to Wolfe at 11:15, after his orchids, over lunch. He listened without interrupting, which is his version of enthusiasm, and ate his braised chicken with the concentration of a man conducting a second simultaneous analysis. The 4 names, he said when I finished. Tell me about them. I had my notebook. Vera Ashwell, Martin's ex-wife, divorced 4 years ago, contested settlement. She got the apartment on the Upper West Side and a lump sum that her attorney described to anyone who'd listen as insufficient. Age 47, works in arts administration. Do they have children? One son, 23, named Philip. He was at Cornell until last year. Currently unemployed and living, according to a neighbor I spoke with, in his mother's apartment. Continue. Number 2. Leonard Hatch. He's a senior managing director at Relic Ashwell. Been there 11 years. His career track runs through Martin Ashwell. Martin brought him in, mentored him, promoted him twice. If the firm survives and Ashwell's investment thesis gets vindicated, Hatch is next in line for a partnership stake. And if it doesn't? If Meridian goes under and the firm restructures, Hatch is probably out. He's Ashwell's man. Without Ashwell, he's an orphan. Wolfe moved on to his second piece of chicken, the third. Diana Reeve. She was Martin Ashwell's girlfriend. Age 34, former corporate attorney, now does consulting. They'd been together approximately 2 years. The relationship was not secret, but was not announced. They appeared together at industry events. She was not listed anywhere as a partner or fiancée. She and Constance Relic were apparently acquainted. Wolfe's eyes came up from his plate at that. Acquainted how? I don't know yet. Mrs. Relic mentioned it without elaborating when I called her this morning. Note that. The fourth. Warren Price. He's an investor, one of the 3 who committed capital to the Meridian acquisition. He heads a family office managing about $400 million. Inherited money from a grandfather who made it in commodities. Price himself is 61. No formal finance training, tends to follow the advice of managers he trusts. He trusted Martin Ashwell, committed $120 million to Meridian, and is now looking at a significant paper loss with no clear exit. Has he expressed his displeasure? His attorney sent a letter to the firm 3 weeks ago. I haven't seen it, but Peckham had heard about it. The words breach of fiduciary duty were apparently included. Wolfe set down his fork. Archie, I want them all here, tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock. All of them. Mrs. Relic, her husband, Leonard Hatch, Diana Reeve, and Warren Price. And Vera Ashwell as well. Vera Ashwell isn't a client. No, but she is a widow of sorts, a divorced one, and widows of any configuration tend to know things about dead men that their business partners don't. He picked up his glass of beer. Tell Mrs. Relic it is necessary. She will object. Remind her of the fee she has already paid. I made the calls that afternoon. As predicted, Constance Relic objected, 3 times, in 3 different registers, and then agreed. Gerald Relic, when I reached him directly, agreed immediately, with the cooperative speed of a man who has calculated that cooperation is his best available posture. Leonard Hatch was guarded, but said yes. Diana Reeve was quiet for a moment on the phone, and then said in a voice I couldn't quite classify, that she would be there. Warren Price's secretary said he was unavailable. I told her to tell him Nero Wolfe was investigating Martin Ashwell's death, and that his attendance was requested, not optional. He called back in 11 minutes and said he would come. Vera Ashwell was last. She answered her own phone on the second ring. I know who you are, she said, when I introduced myself. Someone told me Constance Relic hired Nero Wolfe. That means she's worried. What does she have to be worried about? Mrs. Ashwell, Mr. Wolfe would very much like to speak with you tomorrow evening. About Martin? Yes. Another pause. All right, she said. I'll come. But I'm not coming for Constance Relic's sake. I'm coming because Martin deserved better than a heart attack that everybody's going to shrug at. Her voice had something in it. Not grief exactly, but its more complicated cousin. You tell Nero Wolfe that I'll answer his questions, but I'll ask some of my own. He said, good, which is about as much enthusiasm as he musters for anything that doesn't have pedals. They arrived the following evening in 1s and 2s, and I showed them into the office. I had arranged chairs in the configuration Wolfe prefers for group interrogations, a loose arc facing his desk, with enough space between chairs that each person feels simultaneously exposed and isolated. It's a small architectural trick, and it works surprisingly well. Gerald Relic was not what I'd expected. Given his wife's composed authority, I'd anticipated a matching register. The polished, controlled affect of old money and elite education. Instead, he was a compact, fair-haired man of 53 who carried visible tension the way some people carry their lunch, conspicuously and without apparent awareness of it. His jaw was set, his eyes moved too much, and he sat in his chair the way people sit in dentist chairs, braced for something unpleasant, but determined not to show it. His wife sat beside him, and I noticed she did not touch him, not once. Leonard Hatch arrived next, alone, in a dark suit that was slightly too careful. The suit of a man who has decided that looking professionally appropriate is a defensible position. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of face that's almost handsome, but settles for intelligent. Precise eyes, a mouth that thinned when he was thinking. He nodded at the relics, and sat at the far end of the arc, without explanation. Diana Reeve came in at 2 minutes to 7. She was arresting in the way that some people are arresting without doing anything to merit it. A quality of presence that fills a room from the doorway. She was dark-haired, like Constance Relic, but where Mrs. Relic's composure had the quality of a decision, Diana Reeve's seemed more like weather, natural, unchosen, possibly changeable. She looked at the relics when she entered the room. Constance Relic looked back at her, with an expression I couldn't read from my angle, but that Gerald Relic noticed and responded to with a subtle tightening of the jaw. Warren Price came in at 7 exactly, with the punctuality of a man for whom time is money, and the metaphor has never struck him as a metaphor. He was big, not fat, but large in the architectural sense, a man who'd been well fed from infancy and had maintained the infrastructure. Silver-haired, red-faced, wearing an expression of permanent mild dissatisfaction. He looked at no one and sat in the remaining chair with the deliberate placement of someone staking a claim. Vera Ashwell was last, at 3 minutes past 7. She was smaller than I'd imagined from her voice, compact and sharp-featured, with iron-gray hair cut close, and eyes that had the alert, slightly aggressive quality of someone who has been underestimated recently and found it clarifying. She looked around the room as she came in, cataloging the occupants with visible precision. There was no chair left in the ark. Archie, I said to myself, and went and got one from the hall. Wolfe had entered from the rear while I was doing this, and was now behind his desk, looking at the assembled company with the expression of benign tolerance he deploys when he wants people to feel temporarily safe. He waited for me to add the chair, for Vera Ashwell to sit in it, and for silence to settle over the room like sediment. "I am grateful for your attendance," he said. "I will not pretend the gratitude is cordial. You are here because a man is dead, and the circumstances are insufficient. I am not the police. I cannot compel you. But I can tell you that what I discover, I will act on, and what I act on has generally been sufficient to resolve matters of this nature. If any of you have information relevant to Martin Ashwell's death, the sensible course is to provide it now, without drama and without concealment." He paused. "Mr. Relic," he said, "you were the last person to see Martin Ashwell alive, by your own account. Did he seem unwell during your dinner?" Gerald Relic's hands were flat on his knees. "No, he seemed fine, better than fine. He was in good spirits." Which I found ironic, given the conversation we were having. "The proposed buyout of your stake." He'd made a formal proposal, $42 million for my half of the firm. The firm's current value, based on the Meridian situation, is depressed. I told him the number was an insult. "And that was how you left it?" "I told him I'd have my attorney respond. We shook hands. I left." "Did you shake hands?" Wolfe said. "On the way out? Or did you make a point of shaking hands?" Relic paused. "I don't understand the distinction. A handshake at parting is conventional. A deliberate handshake, one that a man chooses to perform when the meeting has been adversarial, is a signal. Which was it?" Gerald Relic looked at Wolfe for a moment with the expression of a man who has just noticed that the chessboard has more pieces on it than he thought. It was deliberate, he said, quietly. I wanted him to know there were no hard feelings, professionally. And personally? A pause. Martin and I had a complicated history. Define complicated. It was Constance Relic who answered. Martin was my husband's closest professional colleague for 19 years, and for 2 of those years, approximately a decade ago, he was rather more than that to me. She said it with the careful precision of someone detonating a controlled explosion. Gerald knows. It is not a secret between us. Only a secret generally. I mention it because I assume it will emerge regardless. The room changed its temperature. Diana Reeve looked at the ceiling. Vera Ashwell looked at Constance Relic with an expression that contained, I thought, something like reluctant respect. Warren Price looked at nobody, his large face composed in an expression of determined irrelevance. Thank you, Mrs. Relic, Wolfe said. Your candor is noted and appreciated. He turned. Ms. Reeve, you were in a relationship with Martin Ashwell. When did you last speak with him? Diana Reeve brought her eyes down from the ceiling. Friday afternoon, she said. Around 3. He called to say he was having dinner with Gerald and would be tied up for the evening. He said he'd call Saturday morning. She stopped. And he did not. No. Did his manner during that call strike you as anxious, preoccupied? She considered this. He was focused. Martin was always focused, but this was a different kind, like he was running a calculation. Did he mention the name Devereaux? The room moved. It was subtle, a slight adjustment in the collective posture of several people simultaneously. But I've been watching rooms for 12 years, and I caught it. Gerald Relic's hands pressed flatter against his knees. Leonard Hatch's eyes went to his shoes. Warren Price became approximately 3% more still. Diana Reeve said, No, he didn't mention that name. She said it without changing her expression, which meant either it was true or she was very good at something that requires practice. Inspector Kramer came on Thursday morning, which meant the police had found something worth finding. He arrives at the brownstone the way weather arrives. You can feel it coming, and then there it is, filling the office with cigar smoke and righteous exasperation. He dropped into the red leather chair with the possessive comfort of a man who spent too many hours in it to pretend it's unfamiliar. Lit a cigar without asking, and looked at Wolfe with the expression he reserves for people he considers simultaneously indispensable and insufferable. Ashwell, he said, what do you know? A great many things, Wolfe said. What specifically interests you? The M.E. revised his finding this morning. Potassium chloride. Injected. We think in the upper arm. Small puncture. Easy to miss on a first pass. Stopped his heart. Made it look cardiac. Kramer's jaw moved. Which means your client's husband is in a significantly less comfortable position than he was yesterday. My client's husband shook Martin Ashwell's hand and left, Wolfe said. The injection requires proximity, and either cooperation or incapacitation. Was there any indication of restraint? Sedation? Toxicology isn't back yet, but no physical marks of restraint. He looked at me. You were there last night. Who came? I gave him the names. He wrote them down without visible reaction, which meant he'd expected most of them. When I said Diana Reeve, he wrote it slightly slower than the others, which meant something. Reeve, he said. She and Ashwell. That was still ongoing? As of Friday afternoon, yes. We talked to her Tuesday. She said they'd had a disagreement recently. She didn't characterize it in detail. He looked at Wolfe. She came here voluntarily? She did. She was not forthcoming in all particulars, but she came. Wolfe interlaced his fingers on his belly. Inspector, the camera malfunction at the building on East 68th Street. What have you established? Kramer looked at me, then back at Wolfe. How did you know about that? My client informed me. Your client was informed by whom? That is a matter I am still developing. The camera? He does this when he's deciding how much to give away. And the duration of the chewing is roughly proportional to the value of the information. This was a long chew. It wasn't a malfunction, he said. The cable running to the exterior camera was physically disconnected and then reconnected. The disconnection was done from inside the building, from the utility closet on the ground floor. The closet has a lock, but it's a simple one. A capable person with the right tool could open it in under a minute. Access to the closet requires entry to the building, I said. Correct, which means someone either had a key, was buzzed in, or came in while the door was open during normal traffic. From 10:15 to 11:40. Has the evening doorman been interviewed? He's a 60-year-old man named Ferrante, and he remembers almost nothing useful. It was a quiet Friday evening. He says he may have buzzed someone up around 10:30 or 11, a woman, he thinks, but he's not certain. Didn't get a name because he claims Ashwell told him to expect a guest and just wave them through. Wolfe's eyes went to the window. Outside, 35th Street was doing its mid-morning business. Trucks, taxis, a woman with a stroller who had my sympathy. He said, "Did Ashwell make that instruction in person or by telephone?" Ferrante says by telephone around 9 o'clock. So Martin Ashwell, at 9 o'clock in the evening, telephoned his doorman to grant admission to an unspecified guest. He was, at that point, still in the company of Gerald Relic, a curious time to arrange an additional visitor. Kramer stood up, which he does when he's realized something. He didn't say what it was, which is his version of tact. He pointed his cigar at Wolfe. "Whatever you're working on, I want it. Not in a month, not when you've packaged it neatly, when you have something." "You share when it serves you," Kramer said, which is occasionally simultaneous with promptly. He left. Fritz showed him out. I heard the front door close. "He's right, you know," I said. "He is accurate," Wolfe said. "Accuracy and rightness are not always the same." Archie. Martin Ashwell made a phone call at 9 o'clock Friday evening, while Gerald Relic was still in his apartment, to arrange admission for a visitor he expected after 10. He also telephoned Mrs. Relic at 10:30, after Relic had departed, with a warning. He knew someone was coming. He expected that person, and he was sufficiently apprehensive to leave what amounted to a dying message with a woman he trusted, while simultaneously admitting his visitor with apparent cordiality. Which means he either trusted the visitor and was wrong to, or he wanted to appear to trust them. Yes, Wolfe picked up his book, then put it down again, a sign of unusual agitation in a man whose relationship with his books is, in my observation, more reliable than most human relationships. The name Devereaux. Last night, when I introduced it, 6 people in that room showed a physical response. I clocked it. All 6 of them? All 6, including Mrs. Relic, who gave me the name and presumably knew I would use it. Her response was the smallest, a degree of tension in the shoulders. But it was there. He looked at me. She was surprised by something, not by the name itself, by the response it produced in others. I thought about that. She expected some of them to know it, but not all of them. Precisely. Which means the name Devereaux is not a private secret shared between Martin Ashwell and one other person. It is a name that connects several people in that room to each other. He finally picked up his book in earnest. Today. I found it in 3 hours, which is either impressive or indicates that it wasn't hidden very hard. Devereaux was a man. Malcolm Devereaux, age 58, British national with permanent U.S. residency, operating out of a consulting firm on Lexington Avenue called Devereaux Strategic Advisory. The firm's website was the kind that tells you a great deal without saying anything. Photographs of glass conference rooms, language about bespoke solutions, and discreet representation. A client list that was conspicuously absent. The kind of firm that does things for people who would prefer those things weren't discussed at dinner. I found one more relevant fact through a contact at a business magazine who owed me a favor. Malcolm Devereaux had been a consultant to Relic Ashwell Capital. The engagement had begun 14 months ago. The engagement had ended, abruptly, without public explanation, 3 months ago. That put it at the time Meridian was beginning to underperform. I brought it to Wolfe at 4:15, before his second orchid session. He listened, and for a moment, his expression was the one he gets when a piece fits. Not satisfaction exactly, but the absence of the slight dissatisfaction that normally lives on his face. "Find out what Devereaux's engagement involved," he said. "Not from the firm's records. Those will be sanitized. From someone peripheral. A lawyer, a junior associate, someone who was in rooms they weren't supposed to be important in." "You want me to find a leak?" "I want you to find a person who knows something and has not yet decided whether to keep knowing it privately." That's what I said. He picked up his orchid pruning shears and went to the elevator. I went to the telephone. It took me until midnight, and 2 glasses of rye whiskey at a bar on 46th Street. But by the end of the evening, I had spoken with a young associate attorney named Fisk, who had been junior counsel on Relic Ashwell's retainer at a mid-sized firm, and who had left that firm 6 months ago, under circumstances he described as philosophical differences, and I read as, they asked him to do something he didn't like. What Malcolm Devereaux had been retained to do, at Relic Ashwell Capital, was to facilitate the Meridian acquisition. Not the financial due diligence, that was handled internally. The other kind of facilitation, introductions to regulators, conversations with competing bidders who subsequently withdrew, documents that moved through channels that weren't exactly public. Fisk didn't know the details, but he knew that Devereaux's fees had been substantial, that they'd been structured in a way that made them difficult to trace in the firm's records, and that when Meridian began to struggle, someone, he didn't know who, had raised the possibility that Devereaux had misrepresented what he could deliver. He also told me, as I was leaving, that Warren Price, the investor, had known Malcolm Devereaux before the Meridian deal, had in fact introduced him to Martin Ashwell. I went home, wrote it all up, and put it on Wolfe's desk for the morning. Wolfe read my report over breakfast, or rather, over Fritz's egg sardou and 2 cups of coffee, which is Wolfe's breakfast in the sense that a cathedral is a building, technically accurate, and somewhat missing the point. He read without comment, set it aside, and had a 3rd cup of coffee, which meant he was thinking hard enough to need the fuel. By 10:30, he had made a decision. He told me, individual sessions, that afternoon and evening. Each principal to come alone. He wanted them separated from each other, from the information that proximity gives, from the mutual calibration that happens when suspects can watch each other's faces during questioning. He wanted them raw and solitary. I called them, explained that Wolfe required individual consultations to clarify certain points, and arranged the schedule. Gerald Relic at 2, Leonard Hatch at 3:30, Warren Price at 5, and Diana Reeve at 7. Gerald Relic arrived looking better than he'd looked at the group session. More prepared, less braced, as if he'd had time to consult someone or consult himself. He sat in the red leather chair and put his hands on his knees and waited. Wolfe went directly at him. "Mr. Relic, your wife told me that her relationship with Martin Ashwell, a decade ago, was known to you. I want to understand the timeline. When did you learn of it?" Relic's jaw worked. "Why it was happening. I found out about 3 months in. We, Constance and I, had a period of significant difficulty. We worked through it." "With Ashwell's knowledge that you knew?" "Yes. Martin and I had a conversation. A single conversation. He apologized. We agreed to continue the partnership because the alternative was destroying something we'd both built." He looked at his hands. "I was angrier than I let on at the time. I think I'm still angrier than I let on." "Did that anger inform your position on the Meridian acquisition?" The pause was long enough to be informative. "I opposed Meridian because it was a bad investment." "Was it possible to oppose it for 2 reasons simultaneously?" Another pause. "Yes," he said finally. "Yes, it was possible." "Thank you. When you left Ashwell's apartment Friday evening, did you see anyone in the lobby or on the street who you recognize, or who seemed to be waiting?" "No." No one at all? There was a woman, outside on the pavement when I came out. She was facing away, looking at her phone. I didn't see her face. I wrote it down. Can you describe her? Dark coat, medium height, dark hair, I think. It was past 10. The street lighting isn't ideal. He shook his head. She may have had nothing to do with anything. She may have been waiting for a cab. She may have been, Wolfe agreed. Or she may have been waiting for you to leave. After Relic, Leonard Hatch. He sat differently, more forward in the chair, elbows on knees, the posture of someone who's used to presenting in rooms, and has learned that projecting engagement buys good faith. Mr. Hatch, Wolfe began, you were Martin Ashwell's protege. That is not a neutral position when a mentor dies. No, Hatch said, it isn't. What was your personal stake in the Meridian acquisition? Martin's thesis was my thesis. If Meridian turns around, and I still believe it can, the firm's position is vindicated. If it doesn't, we're looking at redemptions, possibly a restructure, and I'm collateral damage. He said it without self-pity, just the flat assessment of someone who's done the math. Did you know Malcolm Devereux? The reaction was different from the one in the group session. Instead of the collective microshift I'd seen in the room of 6, this was individual and specific. Hatch's right hand came up briefly to his mouth, touched his upper lip, and went back to his knee. 3 seconds. I'd met him, Hatch said, through the firm's engagement. What was your assessment of him? He was effective at what he did, which was making things easier than they should have been. A careful pause. I raised a concern, about 8 months ago, that some of what he'd done might create complications if Meridian's performance drew scrutiny. You raised this concern with Martin Ashwell? With Martin, yes. And his response? That Devereux had operated within acceptable parameters. Hatch's eyes were steady, but working. I didn't entirely believe him. What did you believe? I believed Martin had made a promise to someone. I didn't know who. That would be difficult to keep if Meridian failed to perform. And that Devereux was involved in that promise. Wolfe let the silence run for a moment, which is a technique he uses with witnesses who have more to give. Silence creates a pressure that precise questioning sometimes doesn't. I don't know what the promise was, Hatch said into the silence. But you know to whom it was made. Hatch looked at him. I have a strong suspicion, he said carefully. Warren Price. The hand came up to his mouth again. I didn't say that. No, Wolfe said, you didn't. Warren Price was a different kind of animal entirely. He filled the red leather chair in the way very large men fill furniture, with an assumption of ownership. And he looked at Wolfe across the desk with the challenging blankness of a man who has learned that rich people don't have to fill silences. I'll tell you what I told the police, he said. I'm sure you will, Wolfe said pleasantly, but I'm more interested in what you didn't. Price shifted. I don't know what you mean. You introduced Martin Ashwell to Malcolm Devereux. This was before the Meridian acquisition was contemplated. How long before? A pause. 3-4 years ago. I'd used Devereux for some introductions. He's well connected. I thought Martin might find him useful. Did you have a financial interest in the Devereux introduction? A referral arrangement, for instance? No. Did Devereux have a financial interest in the Meridian acquisition beyond his consulting fee? The pause was longer this time. That's a question for Martin. Martin is dead, I'm asking you. I don't know the specifics of his arrangement. But you know there was an arrangement. Price looked at the wall to Wolfe's left. It's a good wall. Books, a watercolor of the Hudson, and it gave him somewhere to put his eyes while he made a decision. There may have been a performance component, beyond the base fee, meaning Devereux would benefit financially if the Meridian acquisition succeeded. Meaning something like that, yes. And if it failed? That, Price said, is a question I have been paying my attorney to ask. Diana Reeve arrived at 7 with the contained energy of someone who has rehearsed calm and finds it costs something. She sat precisely, crossed her ankles rather than her legs, and looked at Wolfe with the focused attention of a woman who has decided that looking directly at things is more effective than looking around them. "Ms. Reeve," Wolfe said, "last evening I mentioned the name Devereaux. You said Martin Ashwell had not mentioned it to you. I want to give you the opportunity to amend that answer." She didn't move. "I didn't say he hadn't mentioned it. I said he hadn't mentioned it during that specific phone call." It was a precise distinction, and she'd held it for 24 hours, which told me she was precise about precision. She knew exactly what she'd said, and she'd said it deliberately. "He had mentioned it at another time," Wolfe said. "Yes, about 6 weeks ago. We were arguing. We argued fairly often near the end. He said that there were things I didn't understand about how the firm operated, that some decisions required partnerships that looked uncomfortable from the outside." He paused. He used the word Devereaux as an explanation, as if the name itself was a category. "A category of what?" "Of necessary compromise," she said. Those were his words. "And you understood what they meant?" "Not entirely. But I understood that he'd done something with Devereaux's help that he wasn't proud of, and that Meridian failing was making that something more visible." She looked at the orchid on Wolfe's desk. "I think Martin was frightened in the weeks before he died. Not dramatically frightened, Martin didn't do drama, but managed careful fear, the kind that makes a careful man more careful." "Did he indicate what specifically frightened him?" "He said once, just once, and then he wouldn't discuss it further, that he'd made a guarantee he couldn't keep, and that the person he'd made it to wasn't the forgiving kind." The room was quiet. Somewhere above us, the house settled. "Did he say to whom he'd made this guarantee?" "No." She looked back at Wolfe. "But I think you already know." Wolfe had given me 3 assignments, which is more than he usually gives me simultaneously, and means he's either very engaged or very concerned. Possibly both. First, Malcolm Devereaux. Find him, talk to him, assess him. Second, the building on East 68th Street. Reconstruct the evening, specifically the hour between 10:15 and 11:40. Third, Vera Ashwell, separately. She'd been at the group session, but hadn't been alone with us, and Wolfe wanted her alone. I started with the building on East 68th Street on a crisp Friday morning, and talked to everyone who'd talked to me. Ferrante, the evening doorman, a Mrs. Halberg from the 3rd floor, who had been returning from dinner at approximately 10:50 and had taken the elevator. A young resident named Coates on Ashwell's floor, who'd come home late and passed Ashwell's door on the way to his own apartment. From Ferrante, I got a more detailed account than he'd given the police, on the grounds that I was not the police and had the ability to make the conversation feel less official. The woman he buzzed up, he was more confident now, with time to think, had arrived at approximately 10:40. Dark coat, he confirmed, with a hood that she'd kept up, despite the fact that she was now inside the building. She'd said Ashwell's name. He'd called up. There'd been no answer on the house phone. Then his phone had rung. A call on his personal cell, which he didn't recognize. And whoever it was had said, "Just say it's a friend from before. Try again." He'd tried again. The woman had gone up. "Someone called your cell," I said, "and told you what to say." "Yeah." He was embarrassed about it, which is appropriate. It was a man's voice, not old, not young. "You told the police this?" "I told them a woman came up. I didn't, the phone call, I didn't mention that part. I got the number from him. It was a prepaid cell, which I could have guessed. From Mrs. Halberg, she'd gotten into the elevator at approximately 10:50. There was a woman in the elevator already, going up. She described her as dark-haired, medium height, in a dark coat, holding her phone, not looking up. At the 6th floor, Ashwell's floor, the woman had not gotten out. Mrs. Halberg had continued to the 8th. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Which meant the woman had gone past Ashwell's floor, gotten out somewhere above it, come down the stairs. From Coates, he'd come home at approximately 11:20 and walked from the elevator to his apartment, which was 4 doors down from Ashwell's. He'd noticed Ashwell's door was slightly ajar, open by 2 inches, maybe 3. He'd thought it odd, but hadn't intervened. He'd heard nothing from inside. 2 inches. I put that in my notebook and underlined it. I went to Devereaux next. His office was on Lexington in the low 40s, a floor of a building that had the deliberately anonymous quality of places where discretion is the primary product. The reception desk was manned by a young woman who told me Mr. Devereaux was not available. I told her to tell him that Nero Wolfe would like to speak with him at his earliest convenience regarding the late Martin Ashwell, and left a card. He called me back within 40 minutes, while I was having a sandwich at a deli on 44th Street. Mr. Goodwin. His voice was British, measured, and contained the kind of deliberate warmth that's a form of control. I'd be happy to meet with Mr. Wolfe. When? This afternoon, if convenient. Say 3 o'clock? I said I'd confirm. He agreed with the ease of a man who's decided that cooperation is more useful than concealment, which itself is a form of information. I called Wolfe, who was in his orchid rooms, and answered the greenhouse phone with audible reluctance. Send him here, Wolfe said. 4 o'clock. And Archie, before Devereaux arrives, speak with Vera Ashwell. I reached Vera Ashwell by phone, and she agreed to see me at noon at a coffee shop on the Upper West Side near her building. She was already there when I arrived. With coffee and a piece of pie, she was systematically demolishing with the unself-conscious efficiency of someone who eats for fuel rather than performance. You're smaller than I expected, she said. You're exactly what I expected, I said, which was accurate, and which seemed to please her. What does Nero Wolfe want to know that he couldn't ask me in a room full of people who had reasons to hear the wrong things? He wants to know what you know about Devereaux. She ate a piece of pie. Martin mentioned him. Not often. He was careful about it. But after the divorce, we stayed in a kind of touch, Martin and I, because of Philip, our son. I noticed that he seemed weighted by something that wasn't just the business. He said he'd brought someone into the firm who was good at getting things done in ways that didn't bear close examination, and that he was beginning to regret it. Did he indicate why the regret? He said, this was about 4 months ago, that the man had moved from being a resource to being a liability, that the relationship had shifted. She drank her coffee. Martin was not a naive person, but he had the particular blind spot of capable men who've always been the smartest person in the room. He assumes he could manage things that can't be managed. What else? She looked at me with the sharp, assessing eyes I'd noticed the night she came to the brownstone. What do you know about Philip? Your son, 23, lives with you. He worked at Relic Ashwell last summer, an internship Martin arranged. Martin was good to Philip, better than he had to be given the divorce. He wanted the boy to have opportunities. She paused. During the internship, Philip saw something he wasn't supposed to see. A meeting, or documentation of a meeting, between Martin and Devereaux. He told me about it in general terms. He didn't understand what it meant, but it had upset him. What did he see? Numbers. Large numbers structured in a way that didn't make sense for normal consulting fees. And a name. Not Devereaux, another name. Which name? She looked out the window, at the Upper West Side going about its Friday business. He said it was an offshore account name. He remembered it because it struck him as odd for a British consultant. It was a French name. She told me the name. I wrote it in my notebook and looked at it. Has Philip told anyone else? I asked. No, I told him not to. She looked at me directly. He's 23, and he's not equipped for whatever this is. I want to know that telling Nero Wolfe keeps him out of it. It does, I said. Wolfe doesn't involve civilians. She nodded, once, with the compressed trust of a woman who has learned to extend it in small, controlled quantities. Then you have what you need. Malcolm Devereaux arrived at the brownstone at 4 o'clock, with the self-possession of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and has his technique down. He was trim, gray-templed, with the careful grooming of someone for whom appearance is professional equipment. He shook my hand, said he was pleased to meet Mr. Wolfe, and sat in the red leather chair as if he'd chosen it himself. Wolfe studied him for a moment. "Mr. Devereux," he said, "I will not waste your time on preliminaries. You facilitated the Meridian acquisition for Relic Ashwell Capital. A portion of your compensation was contingent on the investment's performance. The investment is performing poorly. Martin Ashwell is dead. These facts suggest a geometry." Devereux's expression didn't shift. "They suggest a coincidence." "They suggest a geometry," Wolfe repeated. "Coincidence is what we call geometry we haven't yet drawn. Who was Martin Ashwell's visitor on Friday evening?" "I don't know." "Were you in contact with Martin Ashwell in the week before his death?" "We spoke once, yes. It was a business call." "What was the substance of it?" "He wanted to discuss restructuring the performance component of my fee, given the current situation." "And your response?" "I told him the arrangement was what it was, and that restructuring would require considering all parties to it." A controlled pause. "There were other parties." "Warren Price." The faintest narrowing of the eyes. "I'm not in a position to confirm counterparty information." "You don't need to," Wolfe said. "I want you to understand something, Mr. Devereux. I am not the police. I am not empowered to arrest you or compel your testimony. But I am very good at what I do, and what I do in cases like this is find the thread and pull it until the design is visible. If you were involved in Martin Ashwell's death, I will establish it. If you were not, but you have information that would identify who was, your cooperation now costs you less than your silence will later." Devereux looked at Wolfe for a long moment. "I did not harm Martin Ashwell," he said. "We had a business dispute. Business disputes are resolved in other ways." "They are, and yet he's dead." Yes, and for the first time, something moved behind the controlled surface of Malcolm Devereux's face. Something that might have been, if he'd allowed it, the outline of genuine unease. "And yes, Mr. Wolfe, that concerns me as well." That evening, after Fritz had produced a rack of lamb that deserved more attention than it got, and after I had laid out the complete record of my investigations across Wolfe's desk in the order he prefers, chronological within topics arranged by relevance to the central facts, Wolfe sat and read. He reads investigation notes the way he reads books, completely, without visible skimming, with the occasional small sound that indicates either agreement or reservation. When he finished, he laid the papers aside and put his fingertips together. "The door," he said. "Which door?" "Ashwell's apartment. Coates found it ajar by 2 inches at 11:20. Martin Ashwell, by any account from those who knew him, was not a man who left his door ajar. He was careful, private, and according to Ms. Reeve, had become significantly more careful in recent weeks. He would not have opened his door and failed to close it. Unless he was preoccupied. He was preoccupied because someone was in his apartment, doing something to him, while the door was open by 2 inches. Wolfe's eyes were on the ceiling. The door was left ajar deliberately. Why does one leave a door ajar deliberately? To listen for someone, I said, or so someone can come in without knocking. The latter. There were 2 visitors. The first arrived at 10:40 and went to the 8th floor rather than the 6th. The second had been told, "The door will be open. Come in without announcing yourself." We are dealing with a staged sequence, Archie. Someone orchestrated the entry. I thought about it. The first visitor goes to 8, waits. The second enters Ashwell's apartment with the door ajar, maybe around 11. Ashwell is injected. The first visitor, the one who called Ferrante's cell, is a coordinator. Or a lookout. Or both. Wolfe lowered his eyes from the ceiling. Now, the money. Vera Ashwell's son observed during his internship documentation of a payment structured through a French-named offshore account. This payment was connected to Devereux's engagement. Devereux tells us there were other parties to his arrangement. Warren Price introduced Devereux to Ashwell. These connections are not coincidental. Price and Devereux had an existing relationship, I said. Price brought Devereaux into the deal. If there was a kickback arrangement, Devereaux gets a performance fee, and a portion of that goes back to Price. Then Price committed capital to Meridian, not purely as an investor, Wolfe said, but as a beneficiary of the arrangement. He was on both sides of the transaction. If Meridian succeeds, he profits as an investor and from the kickback. If it fails, he loses as an investor, and the kickback arrangement becomes evidence of fraud, which gives him a motive to make sure nobody talks about it. Specifically the person most likely to talk, the man who had grown frightened and was contemplating some form of disclosure. Wolfe reached for his beer. Martin Ashwell told Diana Reeve he had made a guarantee he couldn't keep, to a person who wasn't the forgiving kind. He was not describing Devereaux. Devereaux is a professional. He would pursue legal remedies or alternative arrangements. He would not resort to potassium chloride. Price, I said. Or someone acting for Price. Wolfe drank. Diana Reeve is unaccounted for between 10 and 11 on Friday evening. You think she was the visitor? I think she is the person most likely to have been standing outside the building in a dark coat when Gerald Relic left at 10 o'clock. I think she is the person who went to the 8th floor rather than the 6th, who called Ferrante's phone to manage the entry, who left the door ajar and came back down at 11. Whether she performed the act or merely enabled it is what I have not yet established. If she was there, she had to be working with someone. She couldn't inject Ashwell and leave the building without Price or someone else inside. Yes, Wolfe said, the injection requires a second person. He set down his beer. There is a thing I cannot yet explain. Why did Martin Ashwell call Constance Relic at 10:30? He had at that point arranged for his visitor. He had left the door ajar. He knew what was coming. Why leave a message? Maybe he'd changed his mind. Maybe he was scared enough to want someone to know. Or perhaps he was not a willing participant in what was planned. Perhaps he was told only that someone was coming to discuss the arrangement, and the message he left was a precaution born of instinct rather than full knowledge. Wolfe's fingers relaced. Either way, the message gave us Devereaux's name, and Devereaux's name gave us the thread. He was quiet for several minutes. I didn't interrupt. When Wolfe goes quiet in that particular way, not reading, not eating, not looking at anything in the room, it means the calculus is running. You don't interrupt the calculus. The other thing, he said at last, Gerald Relic. You think he's clear? I think his motive, while genuine, is insufficient. He is a man who was wronged a decade ago, and adapted. He opposed Meridian because it was professionally unsound, and because opposing it gave him the satisfaction of demonstrating Ashwell's fallibility. He wanted to humiliate Ashwell's judgment, not end his life. The handshake at the door was real. And Hatch? Leonard Hatch knew more than he told me. But knowledge and action are different categories. Wolfe stood, slowly, the way he does everything, and moved toward the door. Archie, I need to know one more thing, and I need you to find it tonight. That's what I live for, I said. Diana Reeve. Where was she between 10 and 11 on Friday evening? Not what she says, what her phone, her credit cards, or a taxi receipt says. I worked the phones until midnight. I called a contact at a car service company, a favor owed from 3 years ago. Diana Reeve had a regular account with them. She had requested a car on Friday evening at 9:50 from her apartment on West 83rd Street to the East 60s, with a return to be determined. The driver had dropped her at the corner of 68th and Lexington at 10:20. She had taken the subway home at 11:50, using her Metro card, which the MTA's records confirmed, because I know someone. 90 minutes, in the building or nearby, for 90 minutes. I put the paper on Wolfe's desk and went to bed. In the morning, Wolfe was in the Orchid Rooms from 9 to 11. I know this because I can set my watch by it, and have, occasionally, for purposes of demonstration. When he came down at 11:15, he had a Miltoniopsis in his buttonhole that he'd cut himself, which he does when he's feeling something adjacent to optimism. Archie, he said, settling in. Today, 2 meetings. Who and when? Diana Reeve at 2. Warren Price at 4:30. Here. Separately. He looked at the Miltoniopsis on his lapel. And I want Inspector Kramer here at 6. Kramer, so we're moving to resolution. We are verifying the final element, and then yes. He looked at me. Do you know what the final element is? The second person in the apartment. The person who performed the act. Diana Reeve, if she was there, enabled access and exit. She did not perform it. She is a former attorney. She is precise about distinctions. This is one she would have maintained. He reached for the current book on his desk, a treatise on the history of apiculture that had nothing to do with anything. The injection of potassium chloride in sufficient concentration to stop a healthy heart requires knowledge, equipment, and a steady hand. It is not the act of a frightened woman or an angry investor. It is the act of a professional. Devereux. Malcolm Devereux describes himself as a strategic consultant. His career prior to the advisory firm includes, I discovered this morning through a reference I will not bore you with, 14 years in various capacities in European financial intelligence and private security work. He is, to use the vulgar term, a cleaner. I looked at him. Devereux was in the apartment. The door was ajar. Diana Reeve created the conditions. Devereux, who had a key, or was admitted by Diana's management of the doorman, performed the act, and left. Wolfe opened his book, then closed it. What I need from this afternoon's interviews is confirmation, not confession. I don't expect confessions. Confirmable behavioral evidence of knowledge they shouldn't have, and one specific factual gap that will be decisive. Diana Reeve arrived at 2 with the composed attention she'd shown before, but something had shifted in the calibration. A slight tightening, like a watch wound one turn past comfort. She sat in the red leather chair and looked at Wolfe. Reeve, he said, you were on East 68th Street on Friday evening, between approximately 10:20 and 11:50. A pause. Not denial, not confirmation, an assessment. I was in the neighborhood, she said. 90 minutes is a significant duration for a neighborhood. Did you enter Martin Ashwell's building? I had been there before. It would be natural. Ms. Reeve, I'm not asking what would be natural. I'm asking what occurred. Wolfe's voice was level, not aggressive. It's a tone he uses when he wants a person to understand that aggression is unnecessary, because the conclusion is already established. Martin Ashwell is dead. You have information that is material to identifying who killed him and how. You may yourself have participated in a manner that carries legal consequence. I am not a priest, and this is not a confession. I am telling you that what you know will emerge, and the question is whether it emerges in a form that distinguishes between one who orchestrated and one who was used. The silence was 20 seconds, I counted. I didn't know what was going to happen to him, she said. She said it quietly, the precision gone from her voice, what was underneath it coming through. I was told he'd agreed to a meeting, that it was a final resolution of the arrangement, that I was there to make sure he wasn't interrupted, that the meeting could happen privately. Who told you this? Warren. She closed her eyes briefly. Warren Price. He told me Martin had made a commitment to him regarding the Devereux arrangement, and that if it came out, it would destroy the firm, and implicate Martin criminally. He said they needed to have a meeting without Gerald Relic knowing. He said Martin had agreed. Had he? I don't know. Martin didn't mention a meeting to me, but I thought he'd been so preoccupied, so careful. I thought perhaps he was handling it without telling me. Warren asked me to manage the entry, to be there. He said it was to protect Martin as much as anything, that there were people who might try to prevent the meeting. And Devereux? Did Price mention him? He said a colleague would be there. I didn't know the name. I didn't see anyone. She looked up. I went into the building. I went to the 8th floor. I waited. I heard nothing. At 11:20, I came down. The door to Martin's apartment was closed. She stopped. It had been ajar when I came down the first time, at 10:45. When I came back down at 11:20, it was closed. And I didn't check. I should have checked. Her voice stayed controlled, but the control was costing her. I left. I took the subway home, and the next morning, he was dead. Wolfe was quiet. You called Warren Price when you heard? Yes. He said it was a heart attack. He seemed genuinely surprised. A pause. I don't know if he knew what was planned. I don't know if he gave the instruction, or if Devereaux acted independently. That distinction may matter legally. It does not change what happened. No, she said. It doesn't. Warren Price arrived at 4:30 and walked into the office with the energy of a man who has decided that offense is the appropriate defense. He sat down heavily and looked at Wolfe with the challenging blankness and said, "Whatever you think you have." "Mr. Price," Wolfe said, "I know about the offshore account. I know about the performance arrangement with Devereaux and its relationship to your capital commitment to Meridian. I know you arranged Diana Reeves' presence at East 68th Street on Friday evening. I know Malcolm Devereaux was in Martin Ashwell's apartment and administered a lethal injection of potassium chloride. What I do not yet know with certainty is whether you gave the specific instruction to kill, or whether Devereaux, faced with a disintegrating situation, acted on his own initiative." Price looked at him for a long time. The challenging blankness cracked, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that things crack when the pressure has been building longer than the surface can hold. What came through was not guilt exactly. It was the expression of a man who has understood, for the first time, that the thing he built has fallen on him. "I didn't tell him to kill Martin," he said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the situation needed to be resolved, that Martin was going to talk, to a regulator, or to Relic, or to someone, that the Devereaux arrangement, if it came out, would be devastating. I said it needed to be handled." He looked at his hands. "I didn't say kill him. But you knew what handled might mean with a man of Devereaux's background." A very long pause. "I thought it would be a conversation, a persuasion. Money changes hands. Agreements are made." He looked up. "I am not a murderer, Mr. Wolfe." "No," Wolfe said. "You are a man who handed a loaded weapon to a known gunman and asked him to solve a problem, and professes surprise at the result. The law has a specific vocabulary for that situation." Price said nothing. There was nothing left to say. At 6 o'clock, Inspector Kramer sat in the red leather chair with his cigar going and listened to Wolfe talk for 20 minutes. Kramer is good at listening when he has to be. He wrote things down. He asked 3 sharp questions, and then he stood up and put on his coat. "Devereaux," he said, "where is he?" "As of this afternoon, his office." He has not been told to expect this conversation. And the girl, Reeve, she was deceived as to the nature of what she was facilitating. That is a matter for the DA. I have told you what I know. Kramer looked at him. "You always have a lot of what you know still left over." "I always give you what you need," Wolfe said. Kramer left. I followed him to the door and watched the unmarked car that had been parked on 35th Street for the past hour pull away from the curb behind him. Wolfe convened the final meeting 2 days later, on a Sunday evening, in the traditional configuration. All parties in the office, arc of chairs before the desk, Wolfe behind it, in his yellow chair like a very large, very calm judicial officer. He had demanded this gathering, the way he always does, through me, by telephone, with the implicit message that those who don't attend will learn what they missed from newspaper accounts. Constance Relic sat next to her husband, and this time she touched his arm once, briefly, when she sat down. Gerald Relic looked at the touch, and at her, with the uncertain expression of a man who has been to the edge of something and come back, and isn't entirely sure yet how he feels about the journey. Leonard Hatch sat at the far end again, as if the distance was his established territory. He looked tired, in the way that people look when something they'd invested in has collapsed, and they're taking stock of what remains. Vera Ashwell was beside him, her sharp eyes moving around the room with the alert surveillance I'd come to associate with her. Diana Reeve was present, accompanied by an attorney, who sat behind her in a chair I'd brought from the hall. Warren Price was not present, for the excellent reason that he had been in police custody since Saturday morning. Malcolm Devereux was not present either. Kramer's people had found him at LaGuardia, with luggage, at 7 o'clock Friday evening, approximately 90 minutes after Kramer had left the brownstone. Wolfe looked at the assembled company, then spoke. "I will be brief," he said. "You have all had a difficult week, and the explanation, while complete, requires relatively little time, because it is logical rather than elaborate. Logical explanations rarely require elaboration. They require only the correct sequence." He settled back. Martin Ashwell died on Friday evening, killed by an injection of potassium chloride administered by Malcolm Devereux, who was admitted to his apartment by the device of an unlatched door, which Diana Reeve arranged, and whose entry was facilitated by Ms. Reeve's management of the building's doorman. Ms. Reeve was not aware that a murder was planned. She believed she was facilitating a private meeting at Warren Price's direction. He looked at Diana Reeve. She looked back at him steadily. Warren Price was the architect of Martin Ashwell's death, though perhaps not in the sense he intended. He retained Malcolm Devereux for the Meridian acquisition, through an arrangement in which Devereux received a performance fee that was structured to benefit Price as well. A kickback, to use the simple word, concealed in an offshore account under a French-named vehicle. This arrangement constituted investment fraud of a pedestrian but effective variety. When Meridian's performance declined, the arrangement became increasingly dangerous. Price stood to lose not only his investment, but his freedom. Wolfe turned his eyes to Gerald Relic. Martin Ashwell had recognized, belatedly, the exposure this created. He had become frightened, not of Price directly, but of the chain of consequences if the arrangement surfaced. He had made, according to Diana Reeve, a guarantee to Price at some earlier point, likely that the arrangement would remain private. He had begun to contemplate some form of disclosure, possibly to a regulator, possibly to his partner. Gerald Relic said quietly, "He was going to tell me." Wolfe looked at him. "What makes you say so?" "The dinner." He kept starting sentences and stopping. "I thought it was about the buyout, about the money, but it wasn't. He was trying to tell me something and couldn't find the way to do it." He paused. He shook my hand. He was saying goodbye to something. "Yes," Wolfe said, "I believe so." He turned to the group. Price learned, through Devereux, who had his own reasons to monitor the situation, including a performance fee he would never collect if the arrangement unraveled, that Ashwell was on the verge of disclosure. Price communicated to Devereux that the situation required resolution. Devereux, a professional of the most literal kind, resolved it. Whether Price's instruction was specific, or whether Devereux exercised his own judgment, is a matter the district attorney will determine. "What about the camera?" Vera Ashwell said. Her voice was steady, which impressed me. The camera in the building was disconnected from inside, from a utility closet accessible from the lobby. Devereux, or someone acting with his knowledge, entered the building during the day on Friday, or possibly earlier, and prepared this element. It is the detail that demonstrates premeditation. Whatever Price intended when he said the situation needed to be handled, Devereux had prepared for a specific outcome. "And Diana?" Vera Ashwell said. Ms. Reeve was deceived. She was told Martin Ashwell had agreed to a private meeting, that her role was to manage his privacy, and that the visitor was a colleague of Price's conducting a financial discussion. She waited on the 8th floor. She heard nothing. She came down twice, once to check that the door was open, and once 35 minutes later, when she discovered the door was closed. She left. She did not know Martin was dead until the following morning. Whether her role, however unwitting, constitutes legal culpability is not my determination. I have given the facts to the inspector. The room was quiet for a moment. Constance Relic said, "What will happen to the firm?" "That is not my domain," Wolfe said. Though I observe that with Ashwell dead, the proposed buyout of your husband's stake is moot. The firm's future depends on Meridian, and Meridian's future depends on forces that predate this case. Your husband was professionally right. Whether he can convert that into a viable business without Ashwell is a question for another room. Gerald Relic looked at his wife. She looked at him. Between them, something was being renegotiated that I couldn't see clearly and didn't try to. Leonard Hatch said, "I want you to know, I didn't know about any of it. The price arrangement, Devereaux's background. I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what." "I believe you," Wolfe said. "Your conscience may be clear of this particular offense. What you do with the knowledge now is your own determination." Vera Ashwell stood. She was the first to do so. She looked at the room. Gerald Relic, Constance Relic, Diana Reeve, with the measuring look that had been on her face since the first evening she'd sat in this office. And then she looked at Wolfe. "He deserved better," she said. "He did," Wolfe said. "Most people do." She left. One by one the others followed, in the slightly dazed way of people who have sat in a room while the furniture of events has been rearranged, and are not yet sure where everything is. I showed each of them out. And when the last one, Diana Reeve, on her attorney's arm, face carefully arranged into whatever shape she could manage, had gone through the door, I came back to the office. Wolfe had the Miltoniopsis from the orchid room on his desk now, a fresh cutting, and was regarding it with the settled satisfaction of a man who has done a day's work and found it sufficient. "That's the whole of it?" I said, dropping into my chair. "The whole that I can establish. There may be elements, the precise degree of Price's explicit instruction, the full nature of the offshore arrangement, that remain for others to uncover. I have given Kramer what is necessary. Devereaux in custody, Price in custody, Diana Reeve facing God knows what, Gerald Relic's firm in question." I looked at the orchid. Mrs. Relic got roughly what she paid for. She paid for her husband's exculpation. He is exculpated. Wolfe's eyes moved to me. She did not pay for our intervention into her own situation, and yet she received it. Her situation being that she had information about a murder and sat on it. More than that, his eyes went back to the orchid. She had a relationship with the deceased that was more than historical. She received a message from him the night he died. She withheld both facts from the police. She came here, I believe, not solely to protect Gerald, but to position herself, to have someone of standing investigating the case, which would in turn provide her some insulation from the consequences of what she knew and didn't say. So she used us. People use us routinely. The question is whether their use is compatible with our purposes. He picked up his book. In this case it was. The truth was the same truth, regardless of who wanted it found. He opened to his page. "Tell Fritz the beer, and whatever he decides for dinner. I leave it to him tonight." "You always say you leave it to him, and then you call down with specifications." "I say I leave it to him as a courtesy," Wolfe said, without looking up from his page. "Fritz understands the distinction." I went to the kitchen and gave Fritz the message, and Fritz gave me the look he gives when Wolfe plays this particular game, which is the look of a man who has made peace with the foibles of genius on the grounds that the genius is worth the foibles. Outside, New York went on as it does, impatient, loud, indifferent to the small private dramas that get resolved in brownstone offices by large sedentary men and their more ambulatory associates. Somewhere Warren Price was explaining himself to people who were not interested in his explanations. Somewhere Malcolm Devereaux was in a room he had not arranged to be in, which was, I thought, a fitting circumstance for a man who arranged other people's exits. I went back to the office, poured myself a rye, and sat at my desk. Wolfe read. The orchid on his desk did what orchids do, which is nothing but beautifully. The brownstones settled around us in the early October evening, solid and familiar, and for a while nothing was required of either of us but to be in it. That's the business we're in. People come to us with their worst situations. We take their money, we ask their questions, we pull the threads, and at the end of it, if we've done it correctly, the geometry is visible. Not pleasant, not clean, but visible. And you can see, laid out before you, exactly how people decided to treat each other and what it cost them. Martin Ashwell had trusted the wrong man, made the wrong promise, and kept it too long. Warren Price had mistaken wealth for invulnerability and discovered the difference. Malcolm Devereux had done what he was built to do, and been caught doing it, which is the only outcome worth hoping for with men of his kind. And Gerald and Constance Relic had driven home together, which is more than a lot of people manage after 19 years and a dead business partner and a history they'd decided to carry rather than put down. I finished my rye. Fritz called us to dinner. It was, all things considered, a satisfactory evening. End of The Velvet Alibi.